There's a pattern hiding in plain sight. Iconic UFC fighters who dominated with their unique styles, only to be blindsided when their opponents figured out the perfect counter strategy. We'll reveal the fights where predictability shattered legends. Can a fighter's greatest weapon turn into their biggest liability? For Anderson Silva, it did. Silva's striking wasn't just world-class, it was in a league of its own. With pinpoint accuracy, lightning-fast reflexes, and the ability to finish fights in an instant, Silva built a reputation as one of the most feared fighters to ever step into the octagon. His dominance was almost mythic. Opponents were so overwhelmed by his precision that many seemed defeated before the fight even truly began. Silva didn't just knock people out, he dismantled them, made them look ordinary. For years, it didn't seem like there was a single weakness in his game. Then along came Chris Weidman. Unlike many others who had been caught in Silva's web of intimidation and dazzling counters, Weidman had a different approach. He refused to play Silva's game. Silva's taunting and exaggerated head movements were all part of his strategy to lure opponents into overcommitting. It had worked countless times before. Opponents would get frustrated, throw wild punches, and Silva would punish them with devastating counters. But Weidman didn't bite. Instead, he stayed disciplined, maintained his focus, and capitalized when Silva's overconfidence led to one crucial mistake. In the second round, Silva dropped his hands, leaned back in his trademark style, and Weidman landed a left hook that changed everything. The knockout wasn't just shocking, it felt like the end of an era. Silva's confidence in his striking had, over time, morphed into predictability. By favoring his counter-striking so heavily, Silva created gaps that weren't obvious until someone like Weidman came along. Weidman, with his wrestling background and measured calm, understood that Silva's taunting wasn't just about psychology, it was a setup for counters. And breaking that rhythm was the key. Silva relied on his opponents to make the first move, and when they didn't, his effectiveness was diminished. Even subtle things, like Silva's tendency to lean away from strikes with his hands down, became exploitable once an opponent remained composed enough to recognize the opening. Weidman didn't need to overwhelm Silva with aggression or engage in a striking chess match that favored the Brazilian. He stayed steady, found his moment, and exposed the risk inherent in Silva's style. This wasn't a fluke or a one-off mistake by Silva. The truth is, Silva's overconfidence in his striking had been a conversation point long before this fight. Fighters like Chael Sonnen had tested him before, though in different ways. Sonnen, with his aggressive wrestling, pushed Silva out of his comfort zone, controlling him on the mat for much of their fight. While Silva ultimately managed to pull out a dramatic submission win in the fifth round, that fight revealed a glaring truth. Silva's dominance was closely tied to his ability to dictate the fight's pace and style. Wrestlers like Sonnen, and later Weidman, represented a different kind of problem. Opponents who could neutralize Silva's striking and expose the other areas of his game. Experts in the MMA world often discuss the danger of mastering one discipline too thoroughly. Strikers who rely almost exclusively on their striking risk leaving themselves vulnerable to fighters who approach the sport with a broader, well-rounded skill set. This concept isn't unique to Silva, but his story is one of the clearest examples of how even the greatest fighters can fall victim to overconfidence in their strengths. Research into MMA trends over the years has shown that the fighters with the longest careers and most consistent success are those who adapt, who incorporate pieces from multiple disciplines to cover vulnerabilities. Silva's case was a reminder that no amount of brilliance in one area of the game can completely protect against the evolution of the sport and the strategic preparation of opponents. It's easy to look at Silva's loss to Weidman as something that could have gone either way. Maybe Silva's taunting had worked in the past, maybe Weidman just got lucky. But the reality is more complex. Silva's tendency to rely on predictable behaviors, taunting, counter-striking, dropping his hands, wasn't a secret. These habits had been observed and discussed by analysts, coaches, and fellow fighters long before Chris Weidman stepped into the cage with him. Weidman was simply the one who had the skills and composure to dismantle the myth. Even the most dominant strikers must evolve their game, because the sport itself is constantly changing. For Silva, his striking was his signature, but it became a trap. Staying ahead in the UFC requires more than one tool, no matter how powerful it is. As we've seen, wrestling turned out to be Silva's Achilles heel, but wrestling also comes with its own problem. And for fighters who refuse to develop striking or expand their arsenal, the octagon can be just as cruel. Wrestlers dominate the early stages of their careers, but what happens when they refuse to adapt? Ben Askren entered the UFC with all the confidence of an athlete who had been untouched in other promotions. His Olympic-level wrestling background and success in Bellator and one championship made him appear unstoppable. Askren's grappling wasn't just good, it overwhelmed opponents. He dragged fighters into his world, controlling them in the clinch, grinding them down on the mat, and making victory seem inevitable once he secured a position. For many wrestlers, this path feels safe, familiar, and proven. But Askren's UFC run would expose the dangers of relying too heavily on a single strength, no matter how dominant it had been before. What was particularly shocking about this fight was how Masvidal didn't just react, he anticipated. In interviews afterward, Masvidal explained how his team had studied Askren's patterns. The way Askren shot for takedowns, the rhythm of his approach, even the angle of his entries. Everything was predictable to someone prepared with the data. "He's an expert at one thing," Masvidal said, referring to Askren's wrestling. Masvidal knew that if he stayed patient and aggressive, he could exploit the one-dimensional approach. That flying knee wasn't improvised. It was prepared, rehearsed, and executed flawlessly. The result revealed how dangerous predictability can be in the octagon. Askren, for all of his accolades in grappling, had a notable weakness: his striking. His stance, his angles, and even his reaction time on his feet hadn't evolved to match the expectations of high-level mixed martial arts. Against other fighters, his wrestling masked those shortcomings. But when someone like Masvidal neutralized the wrestling before it even began, Askren had nowhere to turn. The fight didn't offer Askren any time to adjust, but even if it had gone longer, the gap in his striking abilities was glaring. This wasn't unique to Askren, though. Wrestlers who fail to develop striking have often encountered similar struggles in the UFC when their takedowns are no longer effective. Elite grappling can control fights, but it's not invincible. Askren's loss to Masvidal echoes what's been seen before in MMA when wrestlers cling too tightly to their foundations. Mark Coleman, another legendary wrestler, once faced a similar reality when Pete Williams landed a head kick that ended their fight. Coleman, like Askren, had relied on grinding takedowns and top-pressure wrestling to dominate others. But his striking wasn't developed enough to keep opponents guessing. Eventually, someone figured out that keeping the fight on the feet could turn Coleman's overwhelming presence into a liability. Fighters who rely on takedowns without evolving defensively or offensively in other areas open themselves up to moments like these. Moments where a single shot can negate years of dominance. Mixed martial arts constantly rewards adaptability, and Askren's time in the UFC became a stark reminder of that. In the Masvidal fight, what stood out wasn't just the quickness of the outcome but the deeper implications of what had gone wrong. Askren's predictable entries and lack of striking diversity didn't just happen by accident. They were built by years of relying on wrestling without room for evolution. In other promotions, this might not have been apparent because opponents weren't prepared at the same level. But the UFC is different. Fighters study tendencies with an obsessive focus, often building entire game plans around a single anticipated movement. Askren's loss also highlights a recurring truth in the sport. No one skill set can carry you in the octagon indefinitely. Success requires balance. For wrestlers, this means more than throwing strikes. It means striking as a threat that forces opponents to hesitate. Fighters like Kamaru Usman are examples of this transition. Usman, once a wrestler with a similar approach, put significant effort into developing his striking over time. By doing so, he prolonged his dominance and addressed gaps before they could be exploited. Askren, on the other hand, entered the UFC late in his career and relied on what had already worked, never adapting enough to close those gaps. The Masvidal fight will always be remembered for its spectacle, but beneath the viral highlight is a truth about what went wrong. Predictability. Fighters who don't develop striking or versatility become easy opponents for those who study them. For Askren and others like him, their early dominance created a false sense of security. But the sport doesn't move backward. It's always progressing. Strikers and wrestlers are two sides of the same coin, and as we've seen with grappling, reliance on a single tool leaves vulnerabilities. Next, we'll explore how this plays out for submission specialists who rely on the ground game to survive. Submission artists can end fights in seconds, but their success often depends on a single opportunity. Look at Demian Maia, a fighter whose Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is considered among the most elite in the sport. His ability to manipulate opponents on the ground is legendary, earning him countless victories through submissions that seemed unavoidable once the fight hit the mat. His grappling was so dominant that fighters often seemed trapped in slow motion, unable to escape his precision and control. Maia built his career on being able to outmaneuver opponents in ways that left almost no room for error on their part. However, as brilliant as his skill set was, it came with significant limitations. When Maia faced opponents who could stuff his takedown attempts and avoid grappling exchanges, the weaknesses of his approach became clear. A prime example was his fight against Tyron Woodley, where Maia struggled to impose his game plan. Woodley, a welterweight champion known for both his striking power and high-level wrestling, showcased an almost textbook counter to how a submission specialist like Maia operates. Time and time again, Maia shot in for takedowns, but Woodley's sprawling defense frustrated every attempt. Instead of being able to drag the fight to the ground where he thrived, Maia was forced to engage in a striking battle, a domain where Woodley's superior athleticism and technique gave him a clear edge. The result wasn't just a loss for Maia, it was a showcase of how a one-dimensional game plan can falter against well-rounded opposition. That fight demonstrated the core issue for a submission-based fighter: predictability. Maia's strategy was straightforward but effective when it worked. Close the distance, secure a takedown, and dominate on the ground. Yet once opponents understand that this is the singular focus, they can prepare accordingly. Woodley wasn't just reacting, he was anticipating, knowing that neutralizing takedowns would leave Maia with few other options. Most telling was not just Maia's inability to adjust during the fight, but the way his limited striking highlighted his lack of versatile tools. His punches lacked power and precision, mainly serving as placeholders rather than a credible threat. Against someone like Woodley, that kind of gap in striking ability made Maia easy to outpoint. Maia's struggles against fighters with strong takedown defense weren't isolated. Several opponents who possessed the ability to keep the fight standing or control the clinch exposed the same pattern. Fighters with even a basic understanding of how to circle away from the cage or manage their distance could force Maia into positions that did not favor him. This took away his greatest weapon and put him in a situation where he was constantly forced to play catch-up. Against faster and more dynamic strikers, Maia's inability to significantly improve his striking or develop additional tools placed a ceiling on how far he could go in the later years of his career. Research into this aspect of the sport often points to the difference between specialists and generalists in MMA. A specialist in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu like Maia is unmatched in their element, but when that element is removed, and especially at the elite level, it creates a gap that opponents are motivated to exploit. He's an expert at one thing is an observation shared about numerous submission artists, not just Maia. But in modern MMA, expertise in one area is often not enough to make up for deficiencies elsewhere. In Maia's case, this became apparent as trends in the sport shifted. The fighters who rose to the top and stayed there were often those who could transition fluidly between striking, wrestling, and grappling. Submission-first fighters, however, were left trying to impose a single style, even when an opponent clearly prepared for it. What Maia's story underscores is the need for adaptability in MMA. While his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is unrivaled, his lack of improvements in striking and wrestling became limiting factors by the time he faced the UFC's top contenders. Even moderate strides in those areas could have forced opponents into more difficult positions, giving Maia a better chance to leverage his grappling without being entirely predictable. His career ultimately became an example of the one-trick problem, the danger of mastering a single skill while neglecting others. For submission specialists, the sport is unforgiving when takedowns fail and the fight stays on the feet. But this issue isn't just about specialists or grappling. The real challenge lies in the broader pattern of fighters who fail to evolve, and that's what separates the good from the legendary in the octagon. Why do some UFC legends struggle to maintain dominance? The answer lies in failure to evolve. Even the greatest fighters can't rely purely on what worked in the past. Rousey's lack of evolution turned her early dominance into a fleeting moment rather than a sustained legacy. Her story is a stark reminder of how quickly the sport moves forward. And as we've seen, fighters who fail to embrace that evolution eventually find themselves unable to keep up. So what lessons should today's fighters take from these hard falls? The very patterns that undid some of the greatest can teach valuable lessons for those looking to avoid the same fate. The octagon rewards fighters who adapt. Those who rely too heavily on a single style, whether it's striking, wrestling, or submission grappling, often face brutal consequences when their predictability is exposed. The evolution of MMA favors those who prepare for anything, blending their tools for well-rounded combat. Fighters like Anderson Silva, Ben Askren and Ronda Rousey showed how even the seemingly untouchable can be undone by stagnation. For fans, understanding these patterns reveals the deeper chess match happening in every fight. For fighters, it's a reminder, versatility isn't optional, it's survival. Next time you watch, ask yourself, what's their weakness? Will it matter?